You can give them your entire youth, mortgage your peace, and bleed yourself dry fixing their messes. And the very second you stop serving their ego, they will look at you like you are a total stranger they never even liked. And the hardest pill you are ever going to swallow is this: they never cared about what you did for them. Because a narcissist is only loyal to one thing, and it has nothing to do with you. Let's be honest about how this dynamic actually works in the real world. You probably walked into this relationship thinking, if I just love them hard enough, if I sacrifice enough, if I fix enough of their crises, eventually they'll see my value. Eventually they'll be loyal to me the way I am loyal to them. The illusion of transactional debt is one of the most psychologically disorienting traps you can fall into when dealing with a toxic individual. In normal, healthy human relationships, there exists an unspoken ledger of reciprocity, care, and mutual investment. When you help a partner move, support a friend through a crisis, or sacrifice your own comfort for the sake of a family member, a healthy bond naturally accumulates emotional capital. You trust that your sacrifices are remembered, valued, and will be reciprocated when you find yourself in need. However, entering into a dynamic with a narcissist means this entire rulebook is fundamentally rewritten. They operate on a completely different psychological wavelength, where past contributions carry zero weight, and the ledger is perpetually wiped clean the moment it stops serving their immediate egocentric needs. When you perform acts of service or make deep personal sacrifices for a narcissist, you operate under the comforting assumption that you are building a reservoir of goodwill. You believe that loyalty is cumulative, that 10 years of unwavering support, financial rescue, and emotional sheltering create an unbreakable bond. But to a narcissist, your past sacrifices do not translate into loyalty or gratitude. In fact, they often experience your history of kindness as an uncomfortable reminder of their own internal inadequacy or dependency. Because their fragile ego cannot tolerate feeling indebted to anyone, they resort to a defense mechanism known as psychological erasure. They actively rewrite the narrative of your shared history, convincing themselves and trying to convince you that you never really did anything substantial for them, or worse, that your help was somehow manipulative and harmful. This phenomenon is devastatingly apparent the exact moment you stop serving as a bottomless resource. If you experience burnout, face your own crisis, or simply set a firm boundary, the decades or years of prior devotion vanish into thin air. To them, you are not a human being with a history of accumulated care. You are simply a functional utility that has malfunctioned. The instant the appliance stops working, the debt is canceled because the utility is gone. They do not look back at the mortgage you paid, the tears you wiped, or the opportunities you gave up for them. They only look at the present moment and ask one self-serving question: what are you doing for me right now? Understanding this dynamic is the ultimate key to shattering the trauma bond, because it forces you to accept the harsh, liberating truth that you cannot buy, earn, or sacrifice your way into the loyalty of someone who is fundamentally incapable of valuing anything outside of their own immediate self-interest. Loyalty is fundamentally relational, built on a foundation of mutual trust, emotional investment, and a steadfast commitment to another human being through the highs and lows of life. However, when dealing with a narcissist, the concept of loyalty is entirely inverted and stripped of its humanity. A narcissist is never truly loyal to a partner, a parent, a child, or a lifelong friend. Instead, their allegiance is strictly and exclusively bound to one thing: whatever source of validation, control, admiration, or attention keeps their fragile false self inflated. This phenomenon means that what looks like devotion from the outside is actually nothing more than a functional dependency on what clinical psychology terms narcissistic supply. As long as you are actively reflecting back a glowing image of who they want to be, managing their emotional instability, or shielding them from the consequences of their actions, they will act affectionate, attentive, and seemingly devoted to you. The terrifying catch is that this loyalty is completely conditional on your utility. The moment you fail to provide that specific type of supply, whether by expressing a dissenting opinion, calling out their toxic behavior, experiencing your own vulnerability, or simply running out of energy to keep up with their demands, the illusion shatters instantly. Because they lack whole object relations, which is the psychological capacity to see people as complex beings possessing both good and bad traits simultaneously, They cannot hold a stable, loving image of you when you are no longer serving their immediate needs. In their mind, you are instantly compartmentalized from an idealized savior into a perceived enemy or threat. They do not mourn the loss of the relationship because, to them, you were never an independent person with intrinsic worth in the first place. You were merely a mirror, an instrument, or a stage prop. Recognizing that their allegiance belongs solely to the supply rather than the individual is both heartbreaking and profoundly liberating. It explains why you can spend years bending over backward, being the ultimate supportive partner, only to be discarded overnight for someone new who offers a fresher, more compliant source of admiration. They did not leave you for the new person because that person is inherently better or more deserving. They gravitated toward them because that person provides a renewed, unexhausted hit of supply. Understanding this stark reality breaks the painful cycle of self-blame, helping you see that no amount of perfection, patience, or self-sacrifice could ever secure a narcissist's genuine loyalty, because they are incapable of being loyal to anyone who isn't ultimately serving their ego. To truly understand how a toxic individual navigates human connection, you have to confront the reality of the disposable nature of their relationships. In a healthy relationship, people are viewed as complex, multidimensional human beings with inherent, unshakable worth. Even when conflicts arise or bonds face severe strain, there remains an underlying reverence for the other person's humanity, history, and emotional well-being. But a narcissist lacks the psychological wiring for genuine emotional permanence. To them, people are treated precisely like functional objects or household appliances. Think of a toaster or a vacuum cleaner. You don't value the appliance for who it is. You value it strictly for what it does. You expect it to perform its designated functions seamlessly, quietly, and on demand. As long as it works, it stays in the kitchen. The moment that appliance breaks down, starts making a strange noise, or fails to heat your toast, your emotional reaction isn't grief, heartbreak, or deep reflection. It is frustration and a swift trip to the trash can. You replace it without an ounce of genuine remorse because an object has no feelings, and therefore discarding it carries no moral weight. This exact cold utilitarian calculus governs how a narcissist treats human beings. When you are serving your purpose, managing their crises, inflating their ego, validating their grandiose self-image, or absorbing their emotional dysregulation, you are kept plugged into the wall and utilized to your absolute limit. You are praised, kept close, and treated as if you are indispensable to their daily survival. However, the second you experience burnout, develop your own needs, or exhibit a normal human flaw, the dynamic shifts instantly. Because they suffer from a profound emotional deficit and lack whole object relations, they cannot comprehend that a human being has off days, struggles, or personal limits. Your inability to keep performing at 100% capacity is perceived by them as a personal insult and a functional failure of your utility. They do not sit down to talk through the issue or mourn the erosion of a shared bond. Instead, they immediately begin looking for your replacement. When the discard phase hits, it often leaves victims completely shattered because they realize they were never loved for who they were. They were merely used for what they provided. Recognizing this objectification is the ultimate antidote to the trauma bond, because it cures you of the delusion that your loyalty, patience, or self-sacrifice could ever turn an appliance user into a genuine partner. The deep psychological dissonance of dealing with a toxic individual often crystallizes around what can only be described as a profound, willful amnesia for all of your contributions, sacrifices, and unwavering support. In a balanced, reciprocal relationship, shared history acts as an anchor during turbulent times. When conflicts arise, both people can look back at a track record of mutual care and lean on the bank of goodwill they have built together over months or years. But when you attempt to remind a narcissist of what you have done for them, whether it was financially bailing them out, managing their chaotic career crises, or standing by their side through deep personal failures, you step directly onto a psychological minefield. Rather than sparking gratitude, humility, or even a fleeting moment of self-reflection, bringing up your past contributions triggers an acute narcissistic injury, because their fragile, grandiose self-image cannot tolerate the humbling reality that they were ever dependent on someone else. Their mind instantly rejects the truth of your support. To admit that you saved them, carried them, or poured your lifeblood into keeping them afloat is to admit vulnerability and weakness, which is entirely intolerable to their psychological defense mechanisms. As a result, they deploy immediate, aggressive coping strategies. They will either completely rewrite the history of the event, gaslight you into believing that your sacrifices never actually happened, or flip the script entirely to claim that you were the one who hindered them. They might look you dead in the eye and insist that you forced your help onto them unsolicited, or that your assistance was actually incompetent and harmful all along. This selective memory is uniquely disorienting because it forces you to question your own sanity. You know the exact dates you paid their bills. You remember the sleepless nights you spent nursing their emotional wounds. You carry the physical and emotional scars of the burdens you lifted off their shoulders. Yet they sit across from you, completely unbothered, erasing years of your devotion with a wave of a hand or a cruel dismissal. This amnesia is not a simple failure of memory. It is a defensive necessity for them. If they acknowledge your sacrifices, they have to acknowledge a debt, and a narcissist's ego refuses to be indebted to anyone. Recognizing this pattern is essential for your mental health because it releases you from the exhausting trap of trying to keep score or proving your worth to someone who has a vested interest in forgetting everything you ever did for them. If you are tired of exhausting yourself trying to earn the loyalty of someone who is fundamentally incapable of reciprocating it, hit that subscribe button right now. Let's unpack the reality of these dynamics together. The trap of overgiving is one of the most insidious cycles in toxic relationship dynamics, driven by the false hope that if you just love enough, sacrifice enough, and prove your loyalty deep enough, you will finally unlock a narcissist's capacity for genuine care. When you first encounter their emotional coldness, inconsistency, or cruelty, your natural instinct is to compensate. You double down on your efforts, thinking that perhaps they are just wounded, stressed, or misunderstood, and that your unwavering devotion will serve as the healing balm they need. You start absorbing their responsibilities, walking on eggshells to avoid triggering them, and constantly minimizing your own needs, dreams, and boundaries to keep the peace. You believe that by showing superhuman patience and endless selflessness, you are demonstrating a level of loyalty that is undeniable, creating an unbreakable bond that will eventually make them see your true worth. However, operating this way with a toxic individual completely misjudges the nature of their internal pathology. Instead of inspiring gratitude, your boundless self-sacrifice triggers the exact opposite reaction. A narcissist does not view your overgiving as a generous gift or a testament to your deep love. They view it as a bottomless, infinite resource that they are entitled to exploit. Every time you cross your own boundaries to accommodate their demands, every time you rescue them from the consequences of their own reckless choices, and every time you forgive the unforgivable, you are inadvertently training them to extract more from you. You are teaching them that your time, energy, and emotional well-being have zero intrinsic value and cost them nothing to take. As this dynamic solidifies, the power imbalance becomes absolute. The harder you try to prove your worth through relentless self-abandonment, the less they respect you, because human nature inherently fails to value what comes without cost or consequence. They begin to see you not as a cherished partner or friend, but as an indispensable utility designed solely to buffer them from accountability and discomfort. The tragedy of overgiving is that it traps you in a perpetual state of depletion while simultaneously fueling their entitlement. Breaking free from this cycle requires realizing that your worth was never measured by how much you could endure or sacrifice. True healing begins when you stop trying to earn love from someone who consumes your energy and instead redirect that fierce loyalty and devotion back toward yourself, establishing firm boundaries that protect your peace from being treated as an endless supply. Conditional acceptance is the invisible cage that keeps you tethered to a toxic dynamic, dictating every breath, word, and action you take within the relationship. In a psychologically healthy environment, affection and emotional safety are steady, foundational truths. You are loved for who you are, flaws and all, and while conflicts happen, your core standing as a valued human being is never up for negotiation. But when you are dealing with a narcissist, acceptance is never a baseline. It is a moving target, a tightly controlled currency that is dispensed only when you are strictly compliant with their demands. Their warmth, praise, and validation are entirely dependent on how well you manage their ego, cater to their whims, and mirror their grandiose self-image back to them. This creates an exhausting perpetual state of hypervigilance. You quickly learn that stepping out of line, whether by expressing a differing opinion, voicing a legitimate emotional need, setting a basic boundary, or failing to anticipate their mood swings, results in an immediate and terrifying shift in the atmosphere. The person who was showering you with affection a moment ago vanishes, replaced by cold indifference, silent treatment, or blistering rage. In their eyes, you are instantly transformed from a cherished favorite into a public enemy. This sharp dichotomy stems from their inability to integrate complex emotions. Because they cannot handle nuance, any deviation from absolute submission is treated as a severe betrayal. Living under conditional acceptance forces you to systematically abandon parts of yourself just to keep the peace. You suppress your anger, hide your disappointments, edit your thoughts, and contort your personality to fit into the narrow, rigid box they require you to occupy. You walk through life believing that if you can just be a little more patient, a little more accommodating, and a little more perfect, you will finally secure permanent approval. Yet, the trap of conditional acceptance is that the conditions are designed to be impossible to permanently meet. The finish line is always moving because their internal instability requires constant friction and control. Recognizing this manipulation is the catalyst for your freedom because it helps you understand that their approval was never a reflection of your worth. It was simply a leash, and stepping out of line is the only way to finally break free. The ultimate betrayal in a relationship with a toxic individual is not a sudden explosion, an unexpected crisis, or even a hidden deception. It is the inevitable realization that your unwavering loyalty, patience, and accommodation bought you nothing. When you enter a dynamic with a narcissist, you naturally assume that human bonds operate on a principle of emotional equity. You believe that if you weather enough storms with them, forgive their worst impulses, and stand by their side when everyone else walks away, you are building an unshakable foundation of mutual trust. You operate under the profound conviction that loyalty is a currency that accumulates interest, meaning that your deep resilience will eventually be met with a reciprocal depth of care, respect, and permanent security. However, this belief is a tragic illusion because a narcissist is fundamentally incapable of emotional permanence or genuine reciprocity. No matter how accommodating you are, how many personal sacrifices you make, or how many times you swallow your own pain to keep the peace, you will eventually face the exact same fate as everyone who came before you: devaluation and discard. Their internal psychological landscape is a bottomless black hole driven by a chronic, unquenchable need for validation and control. Because their internal void can never be filled by external acts of love or loyalty, no amount of sacrifice on your part will ever be enough to secure a permanent place in their heart. This inevitable betrayal cuts deeper than any other because it exposes the transactional and hollow nature of everything you built together. When the discard phase finally arrives, it is rarely preceded by a fair conversation or a mutual acknowledgement of your history. Instead, you are cast aside with a cold, shocking indifference that makes it seem as though the years you invested together never mattered at all. They do not look back at your devotion with gratitude. They look at you through the lens of convenience, deciding that you are no longer useful to their ego. Realizing that this betrayal is inevitable rather than accidental is a devastating pill to swallow, but it is also the ultimate catalyst for your liberation. It shatters the lingering fantasy that you could have prevented the outcome if you had just been more patient, more understanding, or more perfect. Accepting this truth frees you from the exhausting cycle of trying to earn loyalty from someone constitutionally incapable of offering it, allowing you to redirect that fierce, enduring devotion back toward yourself where it belongs. Radical acceptance is the psychological gateway to true liberation, marking the exact moment you stop waging an exhausting, unwinnable war against reality. For months or even years, your mind is trapped in a relentless loop of bargaining, second-guessing, and agonizing over the what-ifs. You torture yourself with thoughts like, if I had just handled that argument differently, they would appreciate me. Or if they could just see how much I've given up for them, they would finally change. This cycle keeps you tethered to a fantasy version of the toxic individual, constantly hoping that deep down inside, beneath the coldness and the manipulation, there is a capable, empathetic partner waiting to wake up and recognize your worth. Reaching the point of radical acceptance requires you to shatter that illusion once and for all and look the brutal truth squarely in the eye. It means acknowledging that the person who hurt you is not misunderstood, stressed, or temporarily blinded by circumstance. They are operating from a deep, fixed psychological pathology. They cannot give you what they do not possess. They cannot offer emotional safety because they do not feel it themselves. They cannot grant you loyalty because they are only loyal to their own internal supply. And they cannot value your sacrifices because they view everyone around them as a functional object rather than an autonomous human being. Accepting this does not mean you condone their behavior, minimize the pain they caused, or pretend that the betrayal didn't hurt. Instead, it means you finally surrender the fantasy of trying to fix, heal, or reason with someone who is fundamentally built to consume your energy. When you fully embrace radical acceptance, a profound shift occurs within your nervous system. The frantic, hypervigilant need to earn their approval evaporates because you realize that their inability to care has absolutely nothing to do with your value, your beauty, or your adequacy. It is a direct reflection of their own internal emptiness. Letting go of the hope that they will ever wake up, apologize, or validate your pain feels terrifying at first, but it is immediately followed by an overwhelming sense of peace. You stop looking backward at the wasted years or forward at what could have been, and you anchor yourself entirely in the present. You realize that your freedom was never hidden in their potential to change. It was waiting for you all along in your own decision to walk away, reclaim your power, and direct that fierce, enduring loyalty back toward protecting and loving yourself. The entire journey of untangling yourself from a toxic dynamic boils down to one inescapable truth. You cannot love, sacrifice, or endure enough to wake up a heart that was never built to care. For too long, you have operated under the illusion of the emotional ledger, believing that your loyalty, your endless forgiveness, and your profound selflessness were building a permanent home in their life. But a narcissist does not keep score of your sacrifices. They only keep track of your utility. To them, you were never a cherished partner, a valued friend, or an equal human being with an unshakable right to love and respect. You were functional supply, an appliance meant to serve their ego until you broke under the weight of their impossible demands. The hardest yet most liberating realization you will ever come to is that their betrayal, their selective amnesia, and their eventual discard were never reflections of your worth. You did not fail because you weren't patient enough, accommodating enough, or perfect enough. You simply ran up against a person who is structurally incapable of true reciprocity. Their loyalty begins and ends with their own reflection, and no amount of golden devotion on your part will ever change a bottomless pit into a well. That is why your true freedom does not live in their potential to change, nor does it hide in a retroactive apology that is never going to come. Your freedom lives in radical acceptance. It lives in the moment you stop looking backward at the years you burned trying to fix them and start looking inward at the power you gave away. When you finally release the fantasy of what they could have been and face who they actually are, the spell is broken. You realize that the fierce, enduring loyalty you wasted on someone who consumed you can finally be reclaimed, redirected, and anchored entirely where it belongs, protecting, healing, and honoring yourself.